imagine waking up and you're like just absolutely exhausted. You can't speak, you can't move at all. You try to sit up, but there's this profound, suffocating weight pressing down on you.
Right, yeah, like waking up in a hospital recovery room.
Exactly, yeah. You hear voices talking about your condition, assessing the damage, but as the fog starts to clear, you realize the doctor standing over you aren't talking about, blood pressure or heart rate.
No, not at all.
They're casually discussing armor cores, radioactive munitions, and coolant levels.
It just completely subverts that universal human experience of medical vulnerability. Because in a normal hospital, the language is biological, right?
Yeah, flesh and bone.
Right. But here, the language the protagonist hears is purely industrial. It's mechanical.
Yeah.
And most terrifyingly, it is nuclear.
It's like waking up mid-surgery, only to slowly, horrifyingly realize that the body they're operating on isn't made of flesh at all. The body on the table is actually a massive nuclear-powered tank.
And your human mind is just trapped completely inside it.
Yeah, exactly. So to help you make sense of this nightmare scenario, we've pulled together a stack of sources for you today. A bunch of selected chapters, lore books, and world-building notes from an incredibly visceral piece of alternate history sci-fi called Chernobyl Online.
The world building in these documents is just incredibly dense, honestly.
Oh, it's massive, which is why our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this narrative for you. We're going to explore how the author takes real-world history and flips it entirely on its head, examine the mechanics of how human consciousness is fused with nuclear machinery.
And ultimately try to figure out what this text is trying to tell us about the lengths humanity will go to in order to survive.
Right, yeah. So put yourself in the shoes of this protagonist. You're completely disoriented, feeling what the text describes as this widespread and towering awareness. And as you try to process this, the narrative drops the names of the people operating on you.
Yeah, this is where it gets wild.
You're in a place called Chernobyl Silo 131, and the mechanics working on you are named Dyatlov, Akimov, and Natalia.
Which, those names are meant to induce immediate cognitive dissonance for anyone familiar with Soviet history.
Oh, totally. Anatoly Dyatlov and Alexander Akimov.
Right. They were the key engineers in the control room during the real 1986 Chernobyl disaster. They managed a power plant in our world.
But in the reality of this text, they're acting as, subterranean mechanics.
Exactly. They aren't monitoring steam turbines for a civilian grid anymore. They're flooding coolant into a mechanized soldier. They're monitoring cores 1 through 5 and repairing physical armor that has literally been eaten through by radioactive munitions.
The text mentions the protagonist took a bad hit, and Dyatlov remarks that core memory loss is normal. But I really struggle to understand the physical mechanics of this setup.
How so?
Well, when we hear piloting a mech, we usually think of a person sitting in a cockpit pulling levers, right? Like a guy in a suit.
Yeah, standard sci-fi stuff.
But Natalia specifically warns that if the remaining cores overheat, they lose the mech and thus the mind of the comrade soldier operating it. So, is there a physical brain floating in a jar of coolant somewhere in this machine, or is it something else entirely?
No brain in a jar. The sources strongly imply a much more literal and honestly terrifying synthesis. The mind isn't piloting the machine. The mind has become a byproduct of the machine's function.
Wait, so the biological brain is just gone?
Gone. If the nuclear reaction goes out of control or the coolant fails, the human consciousness ceases to exist. It's entirely dependent on the stability of a localized nuclear reactor to just, sustain its pattern.
Wow, so you aren't just wearing a suit of armor, you are the armor.
Exactly.
If your coolant runs low, you don't just overheat, your very consciousness unravels. And naturally, when you find yourself waking up as a nuclear-powered cyborg, you start asking questions like, why am I here? What happened to the world?
Right, you want answers.
So the protagonist pushes through this amber-hued foggy memory to ask Dyatlov about the state of the war. And Dyatlov's reaction, well, it provides the foundational lore drop for this entire universe.
He is incredibly bitter. Dyatlov's eyes are described as black pearls, and he just snaps at the protagonist for asking questions.
He's so over it.
Completely. But through that weariness, we learn the monumental point of divergence for this ultimate timeline. Because in our world, the explosion of Reactor 4 at Chernobyl is, a defining tragedy of the 20th century.
Right.
But in this timeline, the explosion never happened. Dyatlov tells the protagonist that Boris Sherbina, who historically led the disaster management after the real-world explosion, actually intervened and prevented Reactor 4 from blowing up.
Which, sounds like a good thing on paper, preventing a meltdown.
You think so, yeah.
But by preventing that localized disaster, the Soviet Union's illusion of technological infallibility remained perfectly intact. And the text suggests this unbroken confidence accelerated the Cold War into a hot, global nuclear conflict.
Yeah, things escalated way beyond control.
Gorbachev is dead. Sherbina is now the Comrade General Secretary leading the remnants of the Soviet Union.
And remnants is really the operative word there. The global nuclear exchange left 80% of the planet subjected to lethal radiation.
80%?
Yeah. The sky is perpetually black, utterly absent of stars. The world has just been reduced to gray sand and vaporized concrete. And the author brilliantly juxtaposes this massive global horror with incredibly mundane, bureaucratic frustration.
Oh my gosh, yes. Dyatlov's attitude is the perfect example of that. He complains that Fomin should be the plant director, Sherbina should be in Moscow, and Dyatlov should just have a quiet office in Pripyat.
He's just so annoyed by the apocalypse.
It's like listening to a weary IT manager trying to keep the servers running during the literal end of the world. He's surrounded by radioactive mechs and endless war, and he's just grumbling about how he was supposed to have a corner office.
Yet he's mourning the bureaucracy of the past because the present is just incomprehensible to him. He says, if only it were still here. But Pripyat isn't a bustling city for nuclear workers anymore.
No, it's totally ruined.
Right, it's ruined, it's dark, and less than 1/4 of it is even operational. It's basically been repurposed as the third post for the main defense.
And that defense entirely relies on the MANR. MANR, mechanized, armored, nuclear, robotics.
The only thing left that can actually fight.
Right, because the Earth is 80% irradiated, biological infantry is completely useless, the environment itself is hostile. So you need a vessel that can withstand the wasteland. But the sheer scale of the protagonist's new body, it's difficult to even conceptualize.
It really is.
When the protagonist hears their own voice as an electric distortion asking, "How tall am I?" Dyatlov replies with specs that defy normal engineering.
Yeah, they're 64 feet tall, and 72 feet if the shoulder cannons are activated.
And that is just the top half.
Exactly. Fully extended legs at another 36 feet. We are talking about a machine well over 100 feet tall, armed with nuclear attack vectors and massive mirrored light-bending sensors.
And Dyatlov casually mentions, there are far larger things out there. I mean, the arms race didn't end, it just evolved to match the radiated environment.
Yeah, it just got bigger and scarier.
But the physical size of the MANR isn't the most mind-bending part of this text. It's the philosophical and technical explanation of how these machines operate. Because Akhmov and Natalia notice something happening during the system reboot.
Right.
They realize that every time they restart the reaction, the protagonist breaks awareness from the programming. Dyatlov says they're being born, and he is remembering.
And then Akhmov follows that up by describing the process as the merging of consciousness with nuclear reaction, which results in, quote, rebooting the awareness of the soul.
The awareness of the soul.
Yeah, this is where the text moves from alternate history into, like, deep, heavy transhumanism.
I really need to break this down because merging consciousness with a nuclear reaction sounds almost like magic. How does the lore actually ground this? Like, if the biological body is gone, where does the soul reside?
Okay, so think of human consciousness in this universe as a highly complex, fragile data pattern.
Okay.
The biological human brain was the original hardware that ran that pattern. But when the global radiation made biological hardware obsolete, Soviet scientists had to find a new medium to store the data.
Because flesh just melts out there.
Right. And they couldn't just copy a human mind to a standard hard drive. It required too much energy, too much dynamic chaos to simulate human thought. So they basically encoded the actual architecture of the mind directly into the chaotic energy state of a localized nuclear fission reaction.
That is insane.
I know. The soul becomes a standing wave of atomic energy. As long as the reactor core has coolant and fuel, the pattern of the person survives.
A standing wave of fission. That is such a staggering concept. But is that like salvation or just a curse?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah, because Dyatlov explicitly says, we wanted the peaceful atom. They didn't set out to build towering cyborg war machines. They were forced into this coalition to fight the radiation on its own terms.
Yeah, adapt or die.
He notes that those who could not advance their capabilities lost. It implies they didn't do this to save the soldier's soul. They did it to weaponize the only thing they had left.
Exactly. And that is the core tragedy the author is presenting here. It's a twisted, horrific form of salvation. To survive the radioactive apocalypse, Humanity had to literally become the very thing that destroyed their world.
Surviving the nuclear fire by becoming the nuclear fire?
Yeah, exactly. They preserved the human mind by trapping it in a reactor core designed for war. It's this ultimate loss of humanity in the blind pursuit of just preserving human life.
You sacrifice everything that makes life worth living just to keep the lights on. And the text visually reinforces this loss of humanity when the narrative shifts from the underground silo to the actual surface deployment. Akhmov announces, disconnecting from the mainframe now, full autonomy restored. And the protagonist is ferried up to the surface.
Oh, the imagery of that ascent is striking.
Oh.
Just incredible.
Right.
This massive mechanical body is lifted up a subterranean pillar hundreds of feet until artificial light blooms through the circular blast doors above.
And then the protagonist jettisons 50 feet into the air, throws on their stabilizers, and hovers over this literal ballet of destruction. There are legions fighting below with intense arrow-like ties of white, blue, and green light.
All these crazy colors.
Yeah, and multiple factions, alien-looking enemies in heavy gas masks, other giant robotic wanderers. But what really stood out to me here was the shift in how the story is told.
Yeah, the author completely changes the language of perception here. Down in the silo, the protagonist's senses were described in somewhat human terms, right? Like blurry, heavy, drunk with awareness.
Right, like waking up with a hangover from surgery.
But the moment they reach the surface and their heads-up display activates, that biological processing of the world is completely overwritten.
They no longer just see a battlefield. The text explicitly states they process the environment through clear color indicators with panels for readouts and processing.
The human eye is gone.
Totally gone. They're taking in the geometry of the landscape through multiple synthetic lenses. They use central and side mirrors to literally bend light and awareness. The biological experiences of fear, adrenaline, or wonder, they're entirely replaced by tactical data and targeting systems.
It really highlights the psychological detachment required to operate in this new form.
Yeah.
Because the protagonist hovers there, and these mirrors ignite, acting as nuclear attack vectors. They calmly rain down nuclear light to vanquish these heavily armored enemies on the ground. The text describes it as burning them from the territory.
Burning them from the territory, wow.
It's incredibly cold, hyper-efficient, and just utterly devastating. The human soldier is gone. Only the targeting algorithm remains.
Which leads directly into the climax of the piece. After this devastating show of force, the enemy retreats, and a small garrison of friendly units congregates below the hovering protagonist. These smaller mechs and masked soldiers march up, and they're mourning.
Yeah, a larger allied mech reports that they lost 2 caravans, and that comrades named Analix and Datorum have fallen.
Analix and Datorum.
Yeah, and the contrast in those names is such a vital piece of world building. Think about it. In the silo, we interacted with Dyatlov and Akhmov, human names tethered to real human history.
Right.
But on the radiated surface, the comrades are Analix and Datorum. It shows how far this civilization has drifted from its human origins. But the true realization in this final scene is about how these entities communicate.
Yes, the communication. Because throughout the entire story up to this point, the protagonist has been hearing these bizarre, abrasive noises. The text describes oceanic frequencies, choking distortions, and synthetic, heavy reverberations.
It's just been a wall of painful electric noise.
Yeah. Dyatlov even told the protagonist earlier, "I can't understand you now, but the others will." The protagonist was trying to speak, but only emitting these high-pitched mechanical echoes.
Right, but as the protagonist settles into their new reality on the battlefield, surrounded by their mechanical peers, the perception of that static fundamentally shifts.
It transforms from harsh, choking distortion into understandable language. The text actually describes it as a music.
A music, yeah.
The protagonist realizes that this heavy, deep utterance is the native language of this unnatural congregation. They can understand the mechs, and the mechs can understand them. The biological need for vocal cords and air to speak is just gone. They're speaking the raw electric language of machines.
It is the final, irreversible step in their transformation. I mean, they accepted the physical body in the silo, they engaged in the tactical slaughter on the surface, and now they've adopted the native tongue of the MAR existence.
There's no going back.
No. The bridge to their past biological life is completely burned.
So let's pull back and look at the whole journey you've taken with us through these sources today. We started with a disembodied human mind waking up in a subterranean operating theater, weighed down by an unnatural, towering awareness.
Yeah.
We explored the devastating alternate history, how preventing the localized Chernobyl disaster inadvertently preserved a political system that eventually unleashed a global nuclear apocalypse.
Right.
We broke down the horrifying mechanics of the MANR program, where human minds are encoded into the chaotic fission of nuclear reactors just to survive an Earth that is 80% irradiated.
Wow.
And finally, we witnessed the protagonist's ascent to the ruined surface, where they traded human sight for targeting lenses and human speech for electric frequencies.
It is such a dark, gripping narrative arc. But, the detail that lingers most profoundly is found in the very last paragraph of the source material.
Oh,
Because the protagonist doesn't scream in horror at this realization. They aren't shocked by what they've become. As they listen to the mechanical voices mourning Analix and Datorum, the protagonist simply notes that it made sense.
that made sense.
Yeah. They remember wandering the ruins of Pripyat with that very trio in a past life, and they just accept their new reality.
The ultimate horror isn't waking up as a 100-foot nuclear tank.
Yeah.
The horror is realizing that eventually you don't even mind. You just adapt to the monster you've become.
Which leaves us with a really critical thought to consider about our own world.
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, we look at this sci-fi text and shudder at the idea of humanity merging flesh with fission just to survive an environment they destroyed, right?
Of course.
But look at our current reality. We're increasingly looking toward massive technological interventions like atmospheric geoengineering or seeding the oceans or relying on artificial intelligence to save us from the escalating climate crisis.
Oh, that's a good point.
We are banking on extreme technology to act as our savior. So, at what point does our reliance on engineered survival fundamentally alter what it means to be human? Are we, in our own slow way, building the philosophical foundation for our own MANR suits?
Wow.
Like, are we preparing to adapt to a ruined Earth rather than preventing its ruin in the first place?
That's wow. If the only way to survive the future is to engineer the humanity out of ourselves, what exactly are we fighting to save? Definitely something for you to mull over the next time you hear a pitch for a technological silver bullet. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating, terrifying world of Chernobyl Online. Until next time.